That's it. Now we're officially recording.
Right. Good morning, everybody, and very welcome to this to another webinar in the series of our Early Childhood Research Center events. I'm delighted this morning to have Catherine Day as our speaker, the chair of the Citizens Assembly on Gender Equality, and to welcome Derek Yeo, President of Dublin City University. Before we go into proceedings, I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Jennifer Guevara, who's going to do a few housekeeping tasks before we can get going.
Good morning, everybody. Just to remind you, you may be aware that this webinar is being recorded, and we hope to make it available on YouTube once this presentation finishes. We're going to have today two presentations and a discussion and a Q&A afterwards. So you're more than welcome to use the Q&A button, and please use that one, not the chat, to send us your questions so we can address them in the discussion section. And with that being said, I'm handing over to Professor Derek Yeo, President of Dublin City University.
Thank you, Jenny, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to DCU. I'm here on the beautiful Albert College Park outside my window. I'm sorry that you're not with us in person on campus, but you know that you're always welcome. It's a wonderful, wonderful day. We're delighted with the news this morning about the vaccine rollout, which I think will hopefully bring us on to the next level in terms of our rebuilding. And in that context too, I think it is important that we think and take time out to reflect on what type of society we want to create post-pandemic. I'm reminded that the Renaissance came after the Black Death, and we hope that when we emerge from this, that we will do so into a better world. And nothing is more important in building that better world than starting at the beginning with the education of our children and early years in particular. I'm delighted to welcome everybody around the room, but especially to our guest speaker, Catherine Day, and I look forward to Catherine's insight. I'd like to thank Mathias, my colleague, and the whole crew at the Centre for Early Childhood Education here at DCU. DCU is a public university. We're a public university dedicated to the public good. We do that from a values-based standpoint, and we believe that nothing is more important to the welfare of a nation than the education of its people, and we're absolutely committed to beginning that in terms of early years. And it was in that context that we were very pleased that Desmond sponsored the creation of the Desmond Centre for Early Childhood Education at the university, and the Desmond Chair in particular. And the Mathias came to join us to fill that role. Mathias is a global leader in early childhood policy and professional practice. He led the creation of the DCU-Early Childhood Research Centre, and that's an interdisciplinary centre which investigates early childhood education, policies, pedagogies, politics, and practices. The whole kind of the early years child in the round, as it were, in the world that they live and the world that they'll create. Mathias leads on various national and international projects, and the Research Centre has provided early childhood policy brief to the G20 and the T20 since 2018. We're very proud of that. So the Centre is leading the debate around systemic change and whole system reform in Ireland and internationally. And as I say, we're delighted that that is the case. Meanwhile, the DCU Institute of Education, our faculty, is at the forefront in preparing early childhood educators as change agents. We award a prestigious medal, or I say the Chancellor of the University, Dr. Martin McAleese, awards a prestigious medal to graduates of the university, the Chancellor's Medal. It's not awarded at every graduation or every year, only to exceptional graduates of the university who embody the mission of DCU to transform lives and societies. And we were absolutely delighted that one of the graduates of the Bachelor of Early Childhood Education, Claire O'Keefe, was awarded that medal this year, because she was a passionate advocate for early childhood education. She was just an incredible young woman that, remember where you heard that name, Claire O'Keefe, you'll see it again. As I say, today's theme is important and it's pressing. Early childhood care is an essential part of our society's critical infrastructure, and one that's often overlooked. And we know that Ireland unfortunately lags behind in this regard. Early childhood education care needs a fundamental reform if we're to address the things that matter, things like the needs of modern society, the needs of modern families, the rights of children to education, the rights of families to reliable childcare, and the challenges facing early childhood educators. We are very fortunate in Ireland in that we have a citizens' assembly, which is kind of unique and pioneering. And the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality, chaired by our guest speaker today, Catherine, made a series of recommendations that added to the growing calls for fundamental reform of the sector. The Assembly called for increased state spending from the current 0.37% of GDP to at least 1% by the end of this decade. And it also called very forcefully for a move to publicly funded, accessible, regulated model of childcare over the next decade. So DCU in parallel is very proud of its part in developing the Citizens' Assembly model, and I'd like to call out my colleague Professor Jane Souter in that regard. And the Assembly, as I said, chaired by Catherine, is recognised internationally as a model for working towards social change. Today's event is underpinned by, as I say, the values of the university, our commitment that we must put people first in all of our decision making, all of our actions. We must focus on the things that are important, and we must strive to deliver impact. And certainly nowhere can that be done more tangibly, I think, than with early childhood education. So while we have a lot of catching up to do, as far as our collective responsibility for children is concerned, Ireland has shown remarkable capability for progressive social change and transformation in recent years, changes that couldn't have been imagined 15 years ago. If you think of marriage equality, for instance, again, as a remarkable example. There's no reason to be less ambitious for our youngest children, for our citizens without voices, all of them, children without voices, but children who are learning to speak, of course. We can reimagine early childhood education and care, and we can start now. So I'd like to thank everybody who put the webinar together. My colleague, Dr. Jennifer Guevara, who's a Rising Talent postdoctoral fellow in the Early Childhood Research Centre, who's been extraordinary in so many ways. Aisling Silk of the Early Childhood team at the School of Language Literacy and Early Childhood here at DCU. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Catherine Day. Catherine is a star. Catherine is a patriot in the very best sense of the word, that she's devoted to the welfare of our citizens and developing this great republic of ours. So we're delighted that she's with us. I'm not going to go through her achievements. We suppose we could focus on her role as Secretary General of the European Commission for a decade from 2005. She was the first woman, in fact, to hold that post. She's also more recently chair of the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality. And my friends in Cork wouldn't forgive me if I didn't call out that she's Chancellor of University College Cork. So listen, I'm delighted, Catherine, that you made time for us today, and we look forward to your reflections on this critical matter. So fáilte róg, Catherine.
Thank you very much, President, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for the invitation this morning. I'm delighted to see that now that the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality has concluded, that a debate is developing on its recommendations. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity to discuss some of them with you today. As the President has just said, and as I think most people know, Citizens' Assemblies are something that are becoming part of Ireland's democratic landscape. As the President has just said, previous assemblies have shown just how the voice of informed citizens can help to bring about social change. And that social change is designed to reflect how Irish people want to live their lives today, because the Ireland of today is a very different place from even 2 decades ago, and certainly a very different place from 1937 when our Constitution was written. So we hope, of course, those of us who participated in the Assembly, we hope that the output of this Assembly will be no less the case in terms of promoting progressive social change than the predecessors. And just before I come to the important issue of sustainable childcare, I want to say a little bit about the Assembly for those of you who may not be so familiar with it. It consists of 99 randomly chosen citizens. They were representative of age, gender, region, and social class. And they came together really because they recognized the importance of gender equality. And many of them told us that they agreed to participate in the Assembly because they wanted to help shape the Ireland of tomorrow for their children and their grandchildren. And they did that with a huge amount of personal commitment and dedication. They gave up a lot of their private time. And of course, for many, it was a very big challenge, as it was for us, when COVID broke out and we had to move the Assembly, which had just started. We had to move it online. And in fact, most of the Assembly was conducted online. So that was a big technical challenge and also a personal challenge, because when we started, something like 30% of the participants had never been on a video call before. So they deserve great credit for the leap of faith that they made and for the investment that they made in the Assembly. Now, the Assembly operates on the basis of responding to a resolution from the Oireachtas. And in the Oireachtas resolution, the members of the Dáil and the Seanad explicitly recognised the importance of early childhood education and care. In their resolution, they asked the members of the Assembly to bring forward proposals that would recognise the importance of early years parental care and seek to facilitate greater work-life balance, a topic that we have all discussed a lot in the last 15 months. They also asked the Assembly to examine the social responsibility of care and women and men's co-responsibility for care, especially within the family. And they also asked members to scrutinise the structural pay inequalities that we see in our society and which result in women being disproportionately represented in low pay sectors. And childcare clearly emerged as one of these sectors during the Assembly's deliberations. I've already mentioned the challenge of COVID, and it had, I think, two main effects on our Assembly. The first was that the whole issue of care, those who give it and those who receive it, came very much to the fore. I think we had no meeting in which the issue of care was not debated. And in particular, members focused on how can we better recognise the importance of care and reward it economically. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. And as I've said, the second challenge was to move online. We were the first Irish Citizens' Assembly to move online. So it was a different style of assembly from the previous ones, which had met in person. And although I think there was a certain nostalgia for meeting in person because Irish people love to talk informally as well as in formal sessions, nonetheless, the polling that we did at the end of the Assembly showed that members felt it had been a good experience, even online, and that they are proud, as I am, of the outcome. So the Assembly worked on the basis of presentations of factual data, both on Ireland and international comparisons. And our members were very, very keen to know how do other countries tackle the different issues they were looking at. So they were constantly asking for information on EU member states, of course, since we're part of the EU, but also on the wider world. And we also had a number of members who were working in the care sector. And of course, given the topic, most people had experience of care in one form or another, either receiving it or giving it to children, adults with disabilities, or elderly parents and relations and friends. So with that great range of input, including input from advocacy organizations, and also we invited individuals to explain their personal experience of working in the care sector. And I think that had the effect for the members of bringing the data to life. When you have somebody who's explaining how difficult it is to work in the care sector when you're only earning the minimum wage and you don't have a career structure, for example. And we also heard very moving testimony from parents who had to give up their work to care for adult children with disabilities and so on. So I think the members would say that their views were certainly challenged, and then they didn't all think the same at the beginning. And also their awareness grew. I was struck by the fact that a lot of people thought Ireland would be higher up on comparative league tables of different countries. And they were quite surprised to find that not all of our laws or even our constitution reflects the social situation in Ireland today. So some of the rules, if you like, are behind where the citizens actually are. So out of this ferment of debate, the citizens generated over 500 recommendations initially, and then gradually we worked through them with them, deciding which were the priority messages, and we ended up with 45 recommendations that they adopted by big majorities by electronic voting at the end of the process. Now, before I go into detail, I think it's important to just say something that may be obvious to you. A Citizens' Assembly is not a research group, and it's not a policy advisory group. Its main purpose is to gauge the views of citizens who have taken the time to be informed, to have their views challenged, and to debate with other citizens. So obviously they could not, and they did not, get into things like detailed drafting on the Constitution. They did not try to put themselves in the shoes of the Attorney General to say exactly how the Constitution should be worded in future. They didn't get into designing complex social protection measures, for example. What they did do was to say very, very clearly and in the plainest possible language what they want to see changed in Ireland, where they want the direction of policy to go, and what they do not want. And I think the outcome is a very straight talking, powerful message back to our political representatives in the Oireachtas of what the citizens think of the different issues that the Oireachtas asked them to think about. Another general point I want to make is that it's very important to point out that they were keenly aware that some of their recommendations might involve increased costs for the state. This is a complicated issue because if you change some of your models fundamentally, you may end up actually giving better value to the state and to those who consume the services. But they were aware that some of their recommendations might entail increased costs. And yet they voted by 95% to make a clear statement back to their political representatives that they are prepared to support and pay higher taxes based on the principle of ability to pay to make a reality of their recommendations. And I think that's a very important element of credibility in support of the recommendations. They weren't just engaging in wishful thinking and designing a fanciful world that can never happen. They were sending the clear signal to their political representatives that they are prepared to pay for higher quality public services and, for example, in childcare. So coming now to childcare, I just wanted to set the scene by running through quickly some of the facts that were before the citizens, the facts on which they took their positions. The President has already said, but I'm going to repeat it, that, and it was one of the things that surprised the members of the Assembly, investment for all children aged between 3 and 5 enrolled in early care and primary education, it's only 0.37% of GDP in Ireland. And that compares to 0.63, so more or less double, of the EU average, and 0.6 of the OECD average. So you can see that we are very far down the league table. And in fact, it rises to over 1% for the Nordic countries, which were of particular interest to the members of the Assembly. So UNICEF has a target of for countries to reach 1% of GDP by 2030, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Another figure another fact that struck the citizens very strongly was the percentage of children in Ireland aged between 3 and 5 attending private institutions for pre-primary education. And Ireland is clearly an outlier in this because we have 99% private sector delivery. We have 99% of private sector delivery of this compared to an EU average of 27% and an OECD average of 32%. So we are very much in a minority of how the country delivers early years childcare. And this makes all the participants unhappy. And again, the citizens heard about parents being unhappy because childcare in Ireland is known to be expensive. It consumes about 28% of parents' net income compared to the EU average of 12%. And this figure rises closer to 40% of net income for lone parents. And I think it's been well discussed in the media, including in recent weeks. The average full-time childcare keys for 2019 were 184 euros a week, ranging from 150 to 250 for one child. And this means between 7,500 and 12,500 euros a year of net income for one child. And on top of the costs, childcare for the relevant hours that parents need can be difficult to access. So parents are not satisfied with the current situation. The staff are not satisfied either. People working in the care sector who are predominantly female face low wages, and they find that the burden of administration takes away from directly working with children, so morale is low. One presenter told the Assembly that based on a 2018 Pubble survey, average pay for a room leader in a creche was £12.55 an hour, and for assistant staff, £11.46. Now this compares to the national minimum wage of €10.20 an hour, so it's just above, but the living wage is £12.30 an hour. And so faced with those kind of rates of pay for a responsible and demanding job, it's not surprising that staff turnover was 23% annually. So that means a lack of continuity, difficulty for the providers to keep recruiting staff, and also lack of attraction for staff to stay in the service. And as I said, the workforce in childcare is overwhelmingly female. 98% of the workers are women, and 61% of those are on less than the living wage. So you can understand why the staff are angry and why pre-COVID we've seen protests in the streets about it. And finally, the private providers, those who provide the childcare, they are also frustrated because they feel over-regulated, because they have 3 different inspection systems, and they find that the system is administratively burdensome. So for something that's so important as children start out on their life's journey, it should be worrying to all of us that neither the parents, the staff, nor the providers are content with the current situation. And so our members absorbed all of that, and they also heard the voices of those working in the sector and their experience of a low pay and lack of recognition. Now, if you're interested, you can see all of the presentations on our website, and that includes the presentations that we had from advocacy organizations. For example, you can see there that the National Women's Council made an argument for investment in a public model of early years education and care that would make it affordable for parents and to provide decent pay and conditions for the workforce. We also had submissions from the Children's Alliance and a number of academics as well. So armed with all of this data, and then with their own personal experience as parents or as grandparents, the citizens decided to look at the shortcomings of the system. They also looked at the structural pay inequalities that result in women being disproportionately represented in the sector. And they understood that the availability of high quality, accessible childcare is crucial to women's participation in the workforce. Maybe not everybody wants to go out to work, but a large number of women do. But the lack of suitable childcare, of quality childcare, is certainly a frustration and an impediment that's holding people back. And I think our members were very keenly aware of the stress on parents of the current costs and their frustration about the lack of choice and about the lack of change in the system. So they were very firmly of the view, as President Keogh said, that childcare must move to a central place in our society, and it needs to be recognised and economically rewarded for the fundamental societal good that it represents. And this mood of our members, who were quite militant on the subject, this is reflected in several ways, starting with 2 recommendations that they made on the Constitution. So while I'm talking about individual recommendations, I'm just going to put them up on the screen for you because I think it's easier to, let me see, okay. There we go. So the 2 recommendations, the numbers refer to where they are on the list of recommendations. It's not very relevant to the discussion, but just to explain why they're there. So our constitution was written in 1937. It has been amended a few times, but the articles that the members looked at have not been changed since 1937. So the first thing that they decided of relevance to our discussion today was that we need to extend the protection of the family. Our constitution protects private and family life, but it only does that for the married family. Now, we know today we have vastly different compositions of families. We have the married family where marriage is between a man and a woman, but we have lots of other family mixtures as well. So our citizens saw no reason to discriminate against parents and children who are not in the situation of being a married family. And they are calling for the constitution to be changed so that that protection is afforded to all families. And secondly, and this is where you can see the importance of care to the members of the Constitution. You're all, I think, familiar with Article 41.2, although you may not call it that. It's usually called in the media the Woman in the Home Clause. And they called, as others have done for many years, to delete that article in the Constitution, but not just to take it out. They want it replaced by language that is not gender specific, but that would oblige the state to take reasonable measures to support care within the home and the community. Now, the word oblige is important. They did not want a general aspiration. They wanted to have an actionable part in the Constitution so that the state would be forced, i.e. obliged by court if necessary, to support care within the home and the wider community. But the citizens were also reasonable. They understand that you can't be absolutist. And that's why they put in the language reasonable measures, so that in the end, it would be up to a court to decide if the state had made an effort to support care, was it reasonable or not? So I think that those two overarching recommendations to change the Constitution are very valuable. There was a third one made to put into our Constitution a clause that would guarantee gender equality and non-discrimination. And I'll talk later on about what's going to happen to the recommendations. But in order for the Constitution to be changed, as you know, these three recommendations would have to go to referenda. So then I come to the more detailed recommendations on childcare. You can see here recommendation 4, and it calls for better terms and conditions for people who provide care. Saying, and it would seem to be fairly obvious, that they should have a pay structure and benefits that include sick pay and pensions that reward their level of skill and training. And the parallel that the members in the Assembly saw was with teachers and nurses, who are also providing very valuable care, who have a pay structure, who have permanent benefits, etc. And Part B of the recommendation calls for childcare workers to have a career structure, including access to training, which would enable them to make a career in the sector and to progress in their area, and certainly would hopefully tackle the problem of the very high turnover that we see in the sector at the moment. Moving on then. Yes, moving on. Right. Then I come to recommendation 8, and this calls for a move over the next decade to a publicly funded, accessible and regulated model of quality, affordable early years and out of hours childcare, so comprehensive childcare. And this reflects the figures that I gave you a while ago about how low the Irish level of spending is compared to the countries that we would normally compare ourselves to, like the EU member states and the OECD, for example. And so you can see here that the members call for us to meet the UNICEF target of 1%, and they say by no later than 2030 in order to meet that target of spending 1% of GDP on childcare. That would be a major increase, and I think would lead to very dramatically positive results. Next is recommendation 9, and that deals with parental leave. I said that the resolution asked us to look at work-life balance and also the co-responsibility of women and men for care. And this is how the members responded to that part of the resolution. So they want paid parental leave to cover the first year of a child's life. And they had a lot of debate about little point B here, but they concluded that it should be non-transferable between parents, primarily in order to encourage fathers to take up parental leave in greater numbers than they currently do. They also thought it was anomalous that lone parents would only get half of the leave that a couple would get to take care of a child. And so they want that total leave period for a lone parent to be the same as for a couple. And finally, we had some interesting research explained to us about why is the level of take-up low, particularly among fathers. And that seemed to be very linked directly to the cut in salary that fathers would probably have to take in the current environment. So they called for an increase in pay levels for taking up of parental leave. And as I said, all of this is available on our website, and I really would encourage you, if you're interested, to have a look and to have a look at the presentations that that were made to us, because they contain a wealth of information all pulled together in a very accessible form. I haven't gone into other recommendations like what was recommended on gender norms and stereotypes. There's a lot in there about the importance of education, starting at an early stage and going all the way through, including up to issues like consent in third level, secondary schools and third level. And members were concerned about the overwhelm, and they made the link, which I think most researchers would, between the fact that childcare workers are predominantly female and the low pay in the sector. So they particularly included a recommendation where they want the state to work on increasing the prominence and prevalence of men in caring roles, to get away from the stereotyping that caring is for women and men do other things. And they want the state to fund campaigns to attract men into caring professions, and for the media and the advertising world to make special efforts to improve the visibility of men in caring roles. So I hope from all of this that you can see that the members of the Assembly were very determined in calling for a different model of childcare, and by that they mean a public model, better funded and more inclusive. And they set out the goal in numbers and in terms of time. So this is what I mean about them being very specific. It's going to be up to others, of course, to design the pathways to these goals if the recommendations are accepted. Excuse me. So now I come to what happens next. The Assembly has concluded its work. It tabled its final report with the recommendations on the 2nd of June, and that's available on the website. I would encourage you to watch the video in which the members read out an open letter to the members of the Oireachtas, because the recommendations, as you've just seen, are very clear and focused. So they don't exactly capture the whole mood of the Assembly. But if you look at the open letter, you can see that they want to call very strongly for change and for change now. And they don't want to be waiting in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, still making the same points. So they put it up to their political representatives to say, you asked us to do this work. We took the time and the trouble to be informed, to debate, and we're sending you back now our recommendations, and we are urging you to follow them up. The government has committed to responding to each recommendation. That doesn't mean that they will accept them, but they have committed to going through them and to responding. And they're likely to set up a committee of the Oireachtas to oversee this preparatory work. I hope that that will happen probably after the summer holidays, but well before the end of the year. As our report makes clear, some of the recommendations could be implemented relatively easily. Changing the constitution involves organising a referendum, but we're used to that in Ireland, and that could be done relatively quickly. Others will take more than a decade to deliver, as you have seen with the target excuse me, of meeting the UNICEF target. Excuse me. So for the lawmakers, I think while they might initially see the full agenda as challenging, I hope that they will also see that some of the recommendations are aligned with work that's already ongoing. And if the political will is there, the recommendations could be fed into that ongoing work and then come to fruition much sooner. So, for example, moving to a public model of childcare and trebling the funding, that obviously will take some time, But there are 2 reviews underway in the relevant department at the moment. One is looking at the funding model for the sector, and the other is looking at the operating model. And if the Oireachtas so decided, if they decided to support the recommendations of the Assembly, they could be fed into that ongoing work rather than waiting to set up something entirely new in order to deliver on the recommendations of the Assembly. So we will be encouraging advocacy organisations and in our own contacts with the Oireachtas that they would try to feed into ongoing work streams as much as possible. I would expect that when the Oireachtas sets up its committee to look at the work of the Assembly, that many advocacy groups will make presentations to it, and perhaps also it will invite academic experts in the sector to share their expertise. So I really hope that the recommendations that come from a really representative cross-section of Irish society, having taken more than a year of their own time to debate, to be informed, and then to think what they want to recommend back to their public representatives. I really hope that that work will be taken seriously and supported by the Oireachtas. And there are encouraging signs across the Oireachtas that there can be cross-party support for quite a number of these recommendations. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. That's what how I wanted to explain to you the work of the Assembly, and also the reasons that underpinned why they have made the recommendations that they have. And I'd be very happy now to discuss all that further with you. And I look forward to hearing from you, your reactions and your thoughts on what was an absolutely engrossing and fascinating experience for me. And I think also for the citizens who took part in it. We have a hard version of the report as well as the online version. And a number of citizens have said to me that in future, anytime anybody knocks on the door asking for their votes, they're going to brandish the copy of the recommendations and say, well, are you prepared to support the work that we did on this? So it's just a way of saying that there's, among the citizens who took the time to be informed, there's enormous appetite for and enthusiasm for change. And I think they've done a good job in mapping out where they want it to go. Now it's over to others to make a reality of it. So thank you very much for the opportunity and for listening to me.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, we have a wonderful platform now to actually that urges us to take some action in the space of early childhood education and care. Responding to your presentation of the important work of the Assembly and the recommendations, my question is, what are the implications for the early childhood education and care sector? And I'm going to present a few as I would say, cornerstones for the discussion. And I'm going to end this presentation with an indicative timeline as well, because I think starting now, looking forward, this is what we need to do. And I'm going to share my screen if I can. Here we go. So what are the implications? And here the summary of some of the recommendations again. Moving to a publicly funded system, publicly accessible, regulated model of quality and early childhood system, increase of spending, public investment in the sector, in line with internationally agreed targets, connected to an integrated model of support for parents. So all this, I think, the recommendations ask us it's a call to action for a systemic and integrated approach to policy addressing young children, their families and communities. And if we didn't have it, I suppose we would be asking for a whole of government strategies for babies, young children and their families, which we do have in place. And I suppose just as the Citizens Assembly recommended, feeding into existing work streams, making this strategy a reality is what we should be aiming for now. We did learn a number of lessons in recent years, and it's not just in 2020, looking back at the disruptions caused by a global pandemic. We do know that the Irish early childhood system does not work for children, it does not work well for families, for educators, and it does not work well for society. And this has actually been documented repeatedly over many years, over decades actually, by internal, external observers, but it has become abundantly clear before and during the pandemic. We do know, and I suppose Ireland, like many other countries, has learned it the hard way and quick, that early childhood education and care is an indispensable part of a society's infrastructure. It's an essential public service. There is a right to education and care that we have a responsibility as a society to honor. And we do share a responsibility for all children now and in the future. So transformation and reimagination of the early child education and care system is about a fundamental way of changing, a fundamental change of the way we do things, of structures, of practices at all levels of the system, but most importantly about the way we think about what the purpose of our societal engagement with this, the group of the youngest citizens actually is about, and what the purpose of this is. So what should we be aiming for? We should be aiming for an early childhood education and care system in Ireland that starts with the recognition of all children's rights to education, care and development, as for instance spelled out in the General Comment number 7 of the United Nations Committee of the Rights of the Child. The right to the child to education begins at birth and is closely linked to young children's right to maximum development. And I think this should be framing our discussion and should be our orientation. Early child education and care, I think we need to argue for this, is educational first and foremost. Early child education services provided by highly qualified early childhood educators, not childcare services or childcare workers. And it would be an early child education and care system that recognizes the right of families to reliable care, and making direct connection to the recommendations we just heard about from the Citizens' Assembly. It would recognize the need of a modern society to prepare itself for the future, including the recognition that all children and adults require care, and understood as an ethic about how children and adults in the society should relate to each other. So we're talking about an ambition and an aspiration and a direction towards early childhood education with an ethic of care. And that, of course, is something that is underpinned by an orientation towards a rights-based approach, underpinned by an understanding of early child education and care as a common good and a common responsibility, as something that is universal, should be provided public, and that should be integrated across a number of policy responsibilities. Stating that early child education and care is educational first and foremost, I think we need to talk about education. What do we mean by education in this context? I suppose, and I'm putting this forward for discussion, that the way we organize early child education and care is not just a service for the youngest children and their families. It is, of course, but it is a manifestation of how we, all of us, see ourselves as a society as we enter the third decade of the 21st century. So should we be talking about education and care in questions of education and care for survival, for care for the self, for the community, and for the planet, all interconnected, for individual children, for families, for communities in this country, for the country as a whole, but also for a global community. And this is really about education for the here and now. It's an education for an uncertain future, something that affects individual children, but also affects us all collectively and needs to be connected. A child entering an early childhood education and care service this year will be about 10 by the time we will probably have missed the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. This very same child will be 30 by the time 2050, when it is very likely that we will have missed our carbon emission goals on a global level. What are the experiences we want this child and their families to have starting now? What do we think we as a society can give this child to prepare for the future that is sort of unfolding, but of course, as always, unpredictable? What might the features of such a future-proof early child education care system be? It would be a competent system, it would be a universal system, it would be progressive, and it would be public. What we should be aspiring for is an early child education care system that is, to begin with, competent and effective. And I'm using the term effective because that is an aspiration already in the first 5 strategy, the whole of government strategies for babies, young children, and their families. It should integrate services across a multitude of sectors. It should be delivered locally by educators working under conditions that are appropriate to their high level of qualifications. We heard about that. And it should be locally and nationally coordinated, administered, and evaluated. It should be a universal system for all children from birth, connected to effective parental leave policies. It should be for all families to avoid stigma. It should not be, as John Bennett said so many times when he wrote international reports, it should not be poor services for the poor, as they quite often tend to be. It should be a progressive system with additional resources allocated and supports according to children's very specific needs within that universal system, progressive universalism. It should be a public system provided as a public service and a public responsibility. And it should be a different system, not the one we have fully publicly funded. And I think this is a crucial distinction between a publicly funded early childhood system and a public early childhood system. And I think we need to talk about that distinction, what that might mean. And it should be, and I think we should be aiming high, free at the point of delivery. Some features of such a system and some pedagogical principles that we might sort of keep in mind. And this is from a previous early childhood research center seminar with our colleague Peter Moss from the Institute of Education in University and College London that we had in October last year. And he reminds us that some of the pedagogical principles that we might use to reimagine early child education care would include an image of the child that is not deficient, but is a rich child that has great potential and that speaks, as Loris Malaguzzi from Reggio Emilia reminds us, 100 languages. It will be underpinned by principles of slow learning, slow thinking, slow knowledge, rather than sort of rushing towards pre-defined outcomes and targets. It would be underpinned by a principle of observation and documentation. All learning becomes meaningful in its diversity and complexity, becomes visible, valued, and evaluated. That would make assessment a further principle, a cooperative and dynamic process embedded in everyday experience. It would lead to democratic accountability and move away from what we at the moment have, this 3-tier inspection regime that Catherine referred to in her presentation. And it would be underpinned by the principle of trust and respect for the agency, for the capabilities and the potentialities of children, practitioners, and parents. And we've seen how that agency and the capabilities can play out in the framework of a citizens' assembly, for instance. It can play out in an early childhood education and care setting. Some elements are needed, some constituting elements are needed to create such a future-proof early childhood education care system. We have some in place, others are under construction. And they all need to be sort of brought together into our project of reimagining a competent early child education care system, one that is more than just the sum of its parts. It would be an Irish system. It would not be sort of a taking an existing model from somewhere else in the world and planting it into an Irish context. That never works. Having said that, of course, it is important that we develop whatever we do in relationship with, learning with, and from other countries and their experiences. So it would be a system based on existing diverse services that are close to families and communities, which is one of the assets and the strengths of Irish early childhood education and care at the moment. It would be a system that is a national system, integrated, based on integrated multi-sectoral policy frameworks and governance. So taking that whole of government strategy aspiration, taking that seriously and turning it into actually multi-sectoral policy frameworks. It would be based on, and I think this is something that we urgently need to look at, it would be based on a strengthened, competent and well-resourced local coordination and decision-making, responsibility and planning process. I think one of the elements of the more successful early childhood systems can be found in that relationship between the central framing and the local autonomy. And I think we need to look at this very carefully here in Ireland. It would be based on an integrated data collection, monitoring and evaluation system, replacing the existing distinct and siloed parts of data collection, inspection, and disconnected evaluation elements that we have. It would be based on a democratic accountability, which again asks for a stronger local element in all this. And it would have to be based, and I think this is crucially important, on a confident and united collective identity of the people working in this sector, a collective identity of the early childhood education profession. Who are we as early childhood educators, confidently and competently engaging with the public, with policy, with parents, with communities? There is too much fragmentation in that space. And it would have to be a learning system, a system that is based on research, on reflection, on critical questioning at every level, not just at the level of practice. We will develop this, and we will have to develop this while we're constantly learning with and from other countries, not just in Europe, but also in the global south and across the global north. How do we get there? And this is sort of an indicative, slightly ambitious and probably controversial timeline starting now, but here we go. I suppose what we can ask for now, and this is 2021, is a high-level policy commitment to a universal and public early child education care system, setting the tone, setting the direction. I suppose from next year, 2022, over a period of time, a transition process needs to begin. Public service contracts could be offered to services on a voluntary basis to transfer private enterprise into the public space. That transition period would also run in parallel with the restructuring of the existing city and county childcare committees to coordinate local transition and forward planning, which is urgently needed in this. And it would run in parallel with the phasing in of the new funding model that would, I think we need to write this into this new funding model, begin a process of phasing out the profit element in service provision, in the provision of public services over an agreed time frame. In 2022, next year, building on the recommendations that are currently being developed in various high-level working groups at the Department for Children, we should have established a professional association for early childhood educators, which should be the partner in the negotiations, in all conversations with all the other elements, employers, trade unions, the state regulator, policy, and the public. And we would have developed, and I think, or begin to develop in 2022, a national strategy for continuous professional development and a framework for this to qualify and to orient the transition towards a public and universal early child education and care system. I urgently think, and I think this is something that relates to my earlier remark about the purpose of all this. I suppose what we need is a national conversation, a broad national conversation on early child education and care, to first of all, to actually come to terms with why are we as a society engaging with young children, with other people's children, with all our children, and what are the orientations, the aspirations, who do we see ourselves as a society engaging with the youngest citizens, but also in a more practical way to inform the successor to the first 5 strategy that runs to 2028. And we have to begin now to draft what comes after first 5. I suppose if we get working now, we could aim for 2023. That might be a bit ambitious, but again, up for discussion. We should be able to launch a national early child education care monitoring and evaluation agency. There are some very good examples in other European countries that have done that to replace the existing inspection regime. And then, of course, that timeline develops. All of this really is sort of a suggestion for discussion, but what I'm urging is that we can't afford not to enter that discussion and set the direction of travel now. And I'm going to leave you, as always, with a quote by Paulo Freire, who reminds us that it's what we're doing is no longer about sort of discussing whether or not we want to sort of engage with the future. There are different futures possible, and it's our job to reinvent them now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mathias. So now we would like to share with you some voices from the ground of what they would mean for them to have a public early childhood system.
Hi, my name is Kerry and I'm currently an early years educator at Startbright. Being employed within the public and universal sector means for me job security, with a pension and also salary increments where skills and qualifications are recognised. Also, there is consistent funding for CPD training amongst staff, while also having consistent funding being within a universal and public early childhood system for parents and families to access affordable childcare fees, whilst also being able to work, as we take in children based on their own individual needs.
Hello, my name is Emily Kelly and I work with Startbright Community Preschool in Tallaght, County Dublin. We are a non-profit organisation. Becoming a public sector employee would provide job security for me, and I'd be valued for the hard work that I do for the children and families within our community. Being a public service employee would also mean I would have access to a pension once I retire, paid maternity leave and paid sick leave, something that is not readily available across the childcare sector at the moment. Working in a community service has many benefits for the parents and children within our community. We provide childcare at a low cost to parents who may be attending education or training or employed in low paid employment. Currently, in the service I work in, we follow a 38-week ECC calendar, meaning outside these weeks, the children who attend our service normally do not have a service to attend to. Therefore, their parents, if they want to remain in employment, may have to send their children to a private service, which is at a higher cost to them. Therefore, increasing our ECC calendar length of time would provide more opportunities for parents to remain in employment, and also I would have job security too, as I've been employed for a longer period of time. In our preschool, we've direct links with our local primary schools, which is great. It has many benefits for the children, as the teachers get to know the children that are attending their school prior to entry. In our community preschool, we have many children with additional needs in our service, as we have extra resources available to us that might not necessarily be available in the private sector.
I'm Tanya Ward, the Chief Executive of the Children's Rights Alliance. For me, a universal, public, early childhood education and care system is where every child has access to a guaranteed quality place in early years that is affordable for every family. A public early years programme is essentially the first step in our education system. It's not a business, and its principal focus are positive outcomes for the development of young children.
My name is Dr. Sheila Garrity. I'm the Academic Director of Early Childhood Programs at NUI Galway. For me, a universal and public early childhood education and care system means parents and extended family members feel a sense of belonging, of ownership and responsibility for their local setting. They are truly valued as partners in their children's early learning and care, and co-constructors in research and knowledge creation, alongside their children and the early childhood educators in the setting. The educators recognize as part of their role the importance of family support, provided through reciprocal caring relationships built up over time with the families.
My name is Liam McQuillan. I am the General Manager for Starbright Early Learning Centres. A universal and public early childhood system would mean improved quality, accessibility and affordability across the sector. Children and families' well-being would be supported based on their individual needs and not determined by the allocation of hours because of the employment status of the parent. A public system would value the early childhood workforce and respect their highly qualified careers and reduce turnover in the sector. A public system would be a welcome end to the current divided and expensive system currently in place. Thank you.
My name is Sharon Murray and my role is that of a project leader. I feel a universal and public early childhood system would ensure improvements for early years educators around salaries and contracts. Many early years educators are trapped in contracts that only enable them to work part-time when in fact they need and want to work full-time. Many are leaving the sector because of low pay and unsuitable hours of contracts. If a universal system were in place, as a public servant, I would have security in my career and feel valued for the work I do with young children and families every day. The current model of funding is not available to all families and therefore it is not inclusive. Many families in disadvantaged areas are not entitled to or get limited funding, which means they are excluded from childcare services because of their employment status. The First 5 Early Years strategy makes it clear how important it is for early intervention, particularly for the most disadvantaged children, and I feel the current model of funding, the National Childcare Scheme, penalises these families. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Samantha Hallows and I was an owner-manager of a home-based preschool for the last 12 years. I provided the ECC scheme and the NCS scheme to 16 children and I employed 2 early years teachers to work with me. I've researched and I've studied in early years education for the last 20 years and it has really been a wonderful privilege to be able to provide a preschool service to my community here in Knockline. I had to make a heartbreaking decision to close my small home-based business because I was just unable to secure a decent wage. If a publicly funded model had been guaranteed, well then maybe I would have been able to secure a wage as an owner manager and it would have provided the certainty and sustainability for my business. Going forward, I really hope the government will consider a publicly funded model of investment in early years education to support settings like mine. Thank you.
Okay, so we have many voices on the table, and I guess it's time to move to the discussion with the other voices, the attendees we have here today. There are quite a few questions. I'm going to change to gallery view so we can all listen again by everyone who's here. And so probably Mathias and Catherine, to start with, maybe one of the many questions we have. Sheila Garrity says, thank you, Catherine, for your stewardship of the CA. It is important to highlight the necessary role of care in society. The neoliberal model expects all citizens to be active tax-paying citizens, but fails to recognize that we all need care at points in our life, and we are all providers of care at points in our lives. However, our nation states must afford this fundamental action in and for families. Maybe Catherine, you'd like to react to that?
Well, I think that sums up very much the mood of the citizens in the Assembly. And I think if COVID has taught us anything, it is just how dependent we are for our well-being on those who provide care. And that's why I think the recommendations are so focused on giving caregivers proper pay, conditions, and career structure. To not just give them a round of applause and say what heroes they are, but to actually follow through and to recognize that in reality. And all kinds of points that have come out, including from that collection of voices about parents only getting limited childcare for 38 weeks of the year, assuming that then the woman will still be at home during the school holidays, and that the staff have to work part-time, which is also not attractive for people. So there's, at all levels, I think our citizens were quite right to put their finger on the point that the model needs to change. And I think not only in childcare, but across the board on the care issue, our citizens feel that they don't want incremental change. They want big change now. And COVID has shown us as a country and as the world that if we want to, we are capable quickly of making big changes. So this is now a question of, do we want to do it? As I tried to point out, they understood that you can't deliver the change overnight, but you can make a commitment to it and you can make a start. Excuse me, and I think that's what people are looking for. So I completely agree with the questioner there.
Mathias, would you like to comment as well, or do we move to another question?
Well, I suppose what I'd like to sort of to emphasize here is really that this understanding that we can have system change now, and that it's not about sort of repairing on the edges of welfare systems that we have. And I would extend this beyond the early childhood space, but we're talking about early childhood today. What is required is fundamental change, and what's required is a transition into something that we're reimagining now. And we need sort of a public and a policy debate about not just the direction of travel, but the imagination of where we want to be with an early child education and care system. And I would really sort of fundamentally support what you've been saying. Change is possible. We've shown this, and it's about sort of making a few bold ambitions and some leadership visible and starting the process.
Now that you're talking about reimagination, there's another question here from Steve. And he says, even with a public system, the educational attainments of children from different backgrounds is very different. What can be done to ensure children living in poverty, for example, can really benefit from early years in a public universal system?
Well, several things. First of all, let's stay within the early childhood framework for a moment. We know from experiences and from lots of evidence in this country, but also internationally provided by the OECD and similar organizations, that a universal system provides better quality for all children, and that a system that is targeted at disadvantaged groups leads to what John Bennett says, poor services for the poor. So a universal system is something that has the potential to addressing all children in a way that realizes their rights to education. Second, a universal system doesn't mean treating everybody the same. And here we're getting into the space of equity and equality. A universal system will require to allocate resources and supports very specifically to those who are affected by inequality. And that is something that we need to take into consideration. And thirdly, and I think that's an important point when we talk about integrated multi-sectoral policy frameworks, early childhood education is not a panacea. We are not going to resolve the high levels of poverty and child poverty in this country through early childhood education programs. 1 in 4 people in poverty living in Ireland is a child. That's a 2019 figure, which is very likely to have increased during 2020. So integrated policies, a reduction of poverty as a target across government is something that needs to be an element of such an integrated policy. Early childhood education and care can make very important contributions to that, but it is not the sole and the silver bullet.
And probably relating to that, there's a question about, well, talking about this universal character or feature of the system. Someone here is asking, do you feel that there is a space for targeted supports in this universal system, especially for the most vulnerable whom are being left out due to the NCS?
Well, I think there is, but I don't want to take on all that space here. Maybe we can bring Catherine back into the discussion, because your recommendations really are, they frame early childhood and care in general in a much broader, wider context.
Catherine, you're muted.
Thank you. That's absolutely right. And I'm not an expert in childcare at all. And as I said, the members of the Assembly had their personal experience. A few possibly worked in the sector, but the purpose was to get them to say what they wanted to see, not necessarily to design it. But I do take up the point, and this was part of one of the presentations that the citizens had about the impact of high quality childcare, particularly on disadvantaged groups. Yep. So I think that they were alive to that. But you know, once you get into the detail of trying to design that new system, that's where our work stopped, and we hand over now to, among others, you, the experts, to help the government frame and design the future policy. I think what's coming very strongly from the Assembly is a need for a complete change of system, as Mathias also outlined, but it wasn't the job of the Assembly, and we didn't have the research and the academic capacity to design it, and nor were we asked to. What we were asked was to give the informed views of the citizens. And I think that this is the work that citizens did is so much more compelling than an opinion poll, for example, because they took the time to get the data, listen to the arguments, to understand the links between different parts of policy, and then to deliver their message to government. And it's now over to the experts and to the government, and ultimately to the civil service to work out how to deliver it.
I suppose maybe following up on this in the early childhood space, one element that I believe is crucial in all this is a renewed and well-resourced local element of planning in all this, which will help to build bridges between services and supports for families and parents and the community. which will make connections between the childcare element, the education element, and family and parenting supports in that community. So there needs to be a much greater competence for planning, for resourcing, for outlining that system at the local level. And we need highly competent, well-resourced local structures for that complement the national structure that we have at the moment. We do have a structure in place in the early childhood field. It's the city and county childcare committees. That might be a starting point. They could be reimagined as well. But whatever that we end up with a renewed CCC structure or a different local structure, we need both elements working together: a national orientation, a framework, and trust, competence, and resources, and responsibility for planning and evaluation at local level.
And probably this one is for Catherine to tackle. We go to the domain of finance and public expenditure, and here James is asking, increasing expenditure as a percentage of the GDP means cuts elsewhere. Which area do you think we should get cut? And also, have you, Mathias and Catherine, thought about the impacts on economic prospects for lone parents taking 2 consecutive years leave from the workforce?
Well, on the first question, I wouldn't necessarily say that better funding for a public childcare model would require cuts elsewhere. We have seen in COVID that when more resources are needed, they can be found both at EU level and national level. And it is true that the size of the state in the Irish economy is much smaller than it is in most other European countries. So there are choices to be made. Do we want a bigger state, and are we prepared to pay for it? And that's why I really insisted with the citizens that they look at the cost element and that they say, were they prepared to support higher taxes to get the model that they're advocating? And we had lots of debate about that. It went through several meetings, but even I was surprised by the fact that 95% of them in the end said, yes, we are prepared to pay higher taxes. And I think that's a very important message back to the political establishment. I would even go so far, this is my private opinion, but to say that, previous assemblies have shown that the people's thinking was ahead of their political representatives. And I think on this kind of issue, again, the people are ahead of the political establishment. So I think that's really something for the Oireachtas to chew on and to decide. Has COVID been a life-changing experience for all of us? And do we need to pay much more attention to how we treat the caregivers in our society if we want them to be there at all stages in life when we need them? And if we do, then we have to pay for it. And if you look at what parents are paying at the moment, the research would have to be done, but it's not a given that they would be paying equally high taxes in the future to get a public system compared to what they're paying for at the moment. And certainly, even if they would be getting a much better system, and that would be better for the whole of society and not just for the parents who can afford to pay for it. My second point on the second point about lone parents taking possibly 2 years out of the workforce. First of all, in a lot of continental Europe, it's normal that at least for the first year of a child's life, and sometimes well beyond that, if you look at the Nordic countries, that parents do that. Now they have smaller families on the whole, but certainly it is possible. And again, it's a question of what does our society want? I think Europe is not facing up to the challenge that we have of declining populations, not wanting migration, and wanting to keep up our living standards. So if we, as a matter of gender equality, want to have more shared responsibility for children. And if we as a society want to have more women in the workforce, then we've got to square that circle and at least make the options possible for anybody who wants to do it, and to do it in a way that is good for society. So these are big questions, but now coming out of COVID is absolutely the time to ask them. And that's actually one reason why we moved the Assembly online. We could have waited until COVID had passed and then reconvened the Assembly, but there was an understanding that a lot of policies are being looked at now and being redesigned now. And our citizens certainly wanted to have their say and feed into that process. So I think big changes are possible if we want them. And I hope that the politicians will be listening to this representative group of society when they are sending messages, which I think are amplified by many, many other voices from across the country today.
Mm. Well, that is certainly true. And one of the lessons that we've learned during 2020, during the pandemic in Ireland, but also really across the world, is that the way we organize quite a lot in our societies is not sustainable. And that includes the way we work. A lot of families have made quite interesting experiences during this period. Not always positive, and I do recognize and acknowledge the stress this has brought for many people trying to organize education, childcare, work from home. And it has sort of brought spotlights on a huge number of inequalities. Some of them existed well before COVID, but some of them have been created or exacerbated through COVID, including things like digital inequality but I suppose it does show that we need to move towards more sustainable ways of working, educating, living, organizing societies, and I think that is possible now. And another element, more specifically in relation to the parental leave policies, there is a quite interesting international parental leave policy network that sort of documents policies and implications in different countries. One of the things I suppose that we need to look at is an integrated support policy framework for young children, their families, and for society, including early childhood education and care. Can never be compulsory. It has to be compulsory to provide the framework, provide the service, provide a parental leave policy that is actually workable for both women and men, for both couples and lone parents. And we have to, and it has to be compulsory to offer a universal early child education and care service that is connected to that parental leave policy. But of course, we're not talking about making any of this compulsory. But the experience is that if you offer high quality services, they will be used, and there will be a demand for that, and there will be better outcomes for everybody involved.
Thank you. So we have a last question that might be interesting for you to give us your final remarks and to wrap up. And it's about the relationship of care and education and society. So Mira says, how can we as a society value and bring back care as an integral part of education? Maybe Catherine, you'd like to.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that was very much a question on the minds of members of the Assembly, and that's what they tried to address. And they certainly recognized that if you want our society to value care, they wanted to start with the principle of putting that into the Constitution, because that is where you set out the kind of society we want to have and the rights that people should have. And then they wanted to follow through from that by asking that those who give care should have a level of income they can live on, but also a proper career structure and benefits, etc., as lots of other people do. So to give that, and this is very closely related to gender equality as well, because it's not an accident that the low paid sectors are predominantly those where we have majority of women. So it's a question of gender equality as well. And they want to see the two improved together by making things more gender equal and by giving a proper and due reward to those who do the very difficult work of care. And I think there are worrying studies coming out of COVID to show that, you know, a lot of the burden of homeschooling and keeping things going at home has again fallen on women, and again, will they be able to go back to the workforce? And I think our citizens would say that should be their choice. It shouldn't be forced on them by the lack of alternatives or by the fact that the economics don't stack up. So it's about being, I suppose, a more mature society where we actually follow through on what we do say. We all profess to believe in gender equality, but oops, then we come to, you know, where the rubber hits the road, as they say, and you have, so that's why the question of looking at the structural inequalities of salaries in areas where women predominate was an important element of the request from the Oireachtas to the Assembly, but also then to follow through in terms of saying, okay, we want a public model because it is an obligation of the state to provide care for its citizens, and an obligation of the state to provide high quality services in early years childcare, for example. So I think they have given, if you like, the sketch of the answer. They are not a policy group, as I said. They don't have the research capacity, but what they want is, I think, clearly articulated. Now the delivery moves to the Oireachtas and the government. First of all, how far are they prepared to go to embrace these recommendations? And to the people on this webinar today who are the experts in the field, who could help them to design it, if the political will is there, if the government is to say, yes, we do accept that we need to come into line with the EU and OECD countries on this area, and to have a big shift in how we do this in Ireland, not just adding a few more hours to the current system, which is not a solution. And I think parents, the people who work in childcare, and even the providers all recognise that we are not on the right road at the moment.
So I suppose take home message, change is possible, change is urgent, and we can't really afford not to engage in system change now at so many levels. And I suppose from our point of view here at the Early Childhood Research Centre, it is about making these connections about across the different elements of that political and societal system, to come to integrated solutions, to integrated policies, and to step away from what we are very experienced in Ireland, but also in quite a number of other countries, in engaging in disconnected policy solutions that don't stack up, that don't connect, that don't talk to each other. And I suppose that is something that is a discussion to be had in the policy space, that is a discussion to be had in the public space. And as you say, I fully agree. It is about growing up as a society. And I suppose we're faced with that now. Catherine, thank you very much for finding the time this morning to join us, to share your insights and the process and the implications of that process with us. We are going to continue this discussion. We're going to invite you and others and everybody to join this space again with maybe some more concrete steps towards a reimagined early child education and care system. But I suppose now is the time to actually set the direction of travel. So thank you very much. Thanks everybody for attending, for carving out time on your busy Friday mornings. And I hope your Fridays won't hang too heavy over you before you can go into the weekend. Thanks to everybody who made this possible. Thank you, Jenny, for organizing us, for facilitating the discussion. Thanks to all the practitioners who made a last minute effort to get their little audio recordings to us on time. And see you all again. Thank you.